you, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I am a local historian. I am a curriculum writer by trade, so please don't let that influence you before I do read. My other caveat is I'm in the process of writing my dissertation right now, so I tend to think a little strangely, but I'm happy to be with you here at any rate. I'm going to share with you something called Are We There Yet? It's an introspective look at what might have gone through the founder of Sedalia and his family as they came here. I'm going to start before the Civil War to give you context about how Sedalia was actually founded, and then I will read something from one of my books about the Civil War itself. So this is called Are We There Yet? Are we there yet? Asked Martha Smith as she squirmed in her leather-covered seat, riding high in the yellow carriage. The trip from her home in Kentucky to this new land, Missouri, her father called it, seemed endless for the 4-year-old. Are we there yet? Wondered her mother, Melita Thompson Smith, so far from little David's grave. Will I ever see his final resting place again? Her infant son, her father's namesake, had been buried 4 years before in her Kentucky homeland soil. Are we there yet? George R. Smith, the Sedalia founder, asked himself. He was eager to bury the past. He'd lost his only son. He'd lost his inheritance. That's why he joined his father-in-law's caravan to unsettled Missouri, where land was cheap and plentiful. He was ready for a fresh start, but it hadn't happened yet. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Even the horses seemed to ask, as the steady clop of their hooves tapped out the same query with the intermittent clank of wagon wheels and the soft murmurs of the slaves as accompaniment. Surely we're not there yet. Melita Smith stood outside the rough, primitive cabin destined to be her new Missouri home. 1 room, plus a kitchen and some outbuildings. Unhewn logs, dirt floors, no glass windows. How could she have left behind the majestic home in Kentucky to weather a Missouri winter in this cabin? Yay, we're here! 2-year-old Sarah Smith Cotton couldn't wait to get out of the buggy. She didn't care what the new place looked like. She saw the woods and the big creek, just like home in Kentucky. What a great place to stay and play with her sister and her cousins. That was 1833. When the family traveled to Sedalia. 1835, they'd been here for a while. We're getting there, thought Melita Smith as she surveyed her new cabin in a new town called Georgetown, named after the place they'd left in Kentucky. We're getting there. No, we're not there yet, her husband George R. Smith said as he put his shoulder to the plow one more time. He hated farming. Seemed like that was all he had done since he'd moved to Missouri. He'd been trained as an attorney. Maybe he should have been a Baptist minister after all, like his father and his brother and his uncle. At least they had work. There was no need for law in this new settlement because there was no litigation. Everyone got along and settled their differences. Those Baptist ministers, they still had the marrying and the burying. There was always something for them to do. Skipping ahead about 10 years, 1845, the family settled in Georgetown, still trying to make the best of a new country. I'll tell you how we can get there, George R. Smith exclaimed. He told his neighbors in Georgetown, education. Let's build a school right here in Georgetown. 4 years later, 1849, these people will never get there. George R. Smith continued to grumble. They're quitters. They said they supported the school. They stopped funding before the building was finished. I'll just buy the building and I'll build my own school. 1857, still marching on. I'll tell you how we can get there, George R. Smith told everyone who would listen, and a whole lot more who wouldn't, the railroad. He gave speech after speech. If they won't bring the railroad to the town, I'll bring the town to the railroad. I'll build my own town, even if I have to borrow money to do it. And he did. The people called him a madman. They said he'd never get there. The only place he'd ever get was the lunatic asylum at Fulton. How dare he dream that a railroad could be built across the great American desert and the Rocky Mountains to the Golden Gate? 4 years later, January 1861. We're getting there. Hear that faraway train? The handful of settlers in the new town of Sedalia asked. And it's stopping right here in Sedalia. 4 months later, April 1861. We know what that means as we talk about the Civil War. Where do we go from here? The new town of Sedalia didn't know what was ahead for it. Fort Sumter has fallen. What's ahead? Back to the Smith family, 10 days later, I'm going there. I'm going to meet my little David. Melita Thompson, George R. Smith's wife, thought as she struggled to breathe her last breaths. Pneumonia claimed her life as the clarion blast of the locomotive whistle announced the departure of the morning train. Where are we going? Wondered the Smith family. Within 1 week, the Civil War had started, and their family had been shattered by death. The war and grief marched on hand in hand. Something that George R. Smith's daughter wrote, "It was well for us, perhaps, that the total abandonment of grief was not possible, and that our sorrow was sanctified and perhaps mitigated by the overwhelming and rapidly changing events in our country history. We were sometimes glad that our little mother had been removed from the peril of that hour." She described the situation around the new town of Sedalia during the Civil War. Desperados were turned loose. Union men were in hiding. Farms were deserted. Slaves were freeing their masters. The sacredness and security of home was gone. Life was becoming a chaos. And in the midst of all this, George R. Smith said, "We've got to get out of here." His life was threatened. His outspoken nature, no one can imagine that, but his outspoken nature, and especially his stance as a Union man, had gotten him into trouble. His friends said, "You have to go and take your daughters. Go for your safety." So, once again, they packed up, this time without Melita, their mother. "Are we there yet?" asked Martha Smith as they fled from Sedalia. She described the carriage ride to Jefferson City. The whole country through which we passed was full of returning rebels, and their wild bravado and yells saluted us in every town. We begged our father to get into the back of the carriage, for his position was known throughout the state from his frequent political speeches. We trembled for his safety. This he persistently refused to do so, one stubborn man. Surely we're not there yet, they wondered when they returned to Sedalia. This is our home? This is what we built? Total desolation. While they had been away, while they had been seeking shelter and asylum in Jefferson City, their home had been used for headquarters for the Union recruitment. The farm was stripped, cord wood had been taken, their crops had been removed. It was said that hardly anything was left but the house itself and the yard. Back to Main Street, where we had a battle. We had the capture of Sedalia. Are we there yet? The merchants surveyed what was left of their town, of the businesses they'd started. The buildings had been destroyed. The businesses had been looted and burned. But that sacrifice was small compared to the loss of lives. Worst of all, the blood that congealed in thickened clumps on the dusty streets. After the Civil War, a new band of settlers. Are we there yet? We're seeking a fresh start in this city we've heard about. Some had been stationed in the city as soldiers. Others had just heard about the city's potential and thought it was a good place to go. They were ready to hang a shingle in this railroad town, watch it grow. And it did after the Civil War. Present day, 2013. Are we there yet? Crowds today in downtown Sedalia thronged the same area George R. Smith selected for his new town. They walked the streets that the Civil War soldiers had trudged. 150 years had passed since the battle. Today we're waging battles, different campaigns against things like economic hardship, hunger, and countless struggles that were never envisioned during the Civil War. The battle is different, but the spirit is the same, onward and upward. So are we there yet? We're not there yet, but we're still on our way. Thank you. I'm going to share in this set a little bit from this book called All Along Ohio Street. I have a series of downtown Sedalia. I've published 2 volumes. This is an overview that has a decade-by-decade development of Sedalia in narrative and pictures. The back part of the book has features on many of the longtime businesses here. And it's exciting. One of the families that I interviewed passed by a little bit a while ago, so it's fun to still be able to make connections. I'm going to read the section that talks about the founding of Sedalia up to the Civil War, because it's difficult to talk about one without the other. As I said earlier, Sedalia was founded in 1861, and then the Civil War began. So we really didn't know a town without the war until the war was over. So I'm just going to share a few excerpts from a book called All Along Ohio Street. General George R. Smith wasn't a quitter. In 1858, through his tenacity, or his lunacy, as his detractors claimed, he ignored the bidders' response when he tried to sell lots in his new town. Smith's potential buyers weren't satisfied with Georgetown, Missouri, then the county seat. They had selected Georgetown because of its timber and the access to Muddy Creek. Wooded hills appealed to the pioneer farmers, explained one of Smith's biographers. To them, the prairie ground was poor. Tall timber, the woods, meant fertile soil. So it's no wonder that people scoffed when Smith purchased 337 acres of treeless prairie ground in 1856. Smith had to borrow money. He borrowed $5,000 at 6% interest to close the deal. And as if that weren't enough, he had to buy an additional 166 acres of prairie grounds the next month. Smith purchased the land not for its current state, but for its potential. He thought it held the promise of becoming a railroad terminus. He'd been unable to get the railroad to Georgetown, so he was going to bring the Georgetown to his new Sedalia. He turned a deaf ear to his scoffers, and he filed the plat for his new town in 1857. He named it Sedville, after his nickname for his youngest daughter, Sarah. He called her Sed. The name Sedalia was later suggested because a friend of his said, you know, Sedville, that just doesn't sound like the fancy city you're hoping to have. He said, think about Philadelphia, other cities with a more higher sounding termination, and so that was where he came up with that. Smith offered the first lots at auction in 1858, and they sold for $50 and $75 to those who stopped scoffing long enough to place a bid. It's said that Sedalia existed only on paper, really, from November 1857 to 1860. There were 3 houses in the Sedalia city limits, and one of those was George R. Smith's. The new city began to look more promising when the Missouri Pacific, later the Pacific Railroad, later Missouri Pacific, agreed to place a depot on Smith's land. They had a second public auction in October of 1860, and at that time, the sales started to take off. And Smith fully expected his city to grow to the north. He had it platted that way. And the few people who chose to settle there actually settled there because they thought if the city failed, they were closer to Georgetown, where they had, many of them had just moved from, so they felt like they could make a hasty exit. On New Year's Day, 1861, and we know 1861 ties in with what we're talking about today, downtown Sedalia was just a few frame buildings, fewer than a dozen, had no churches or schools, and wide open prairie land. The scene changed January 17, 1861, when the first passenger train reached Sedalia, and it reached Sedalia near where our current depot is down on Main Street. A biographer noted when the railroad reached Sedalia, there was a genuine rush for Sedalia, like that made for a rich mining district in the far west. They were thinking of the 1849ers. Another article concurred. Then commenced the sound of the hammer in earnest, and buildings were erected. Sedalia's population at the end of 1861 was around 300, representing 25 families. We had about 25 to 30 business houses, as they called them then, in the downtown district. They were called business houses, largely because they were businesses on the bottom and houses on the top. Many of the buildings that still stand were designed that way. My office is in a building that was built in 1884 down the street, and the upstairs was an apartment, and I'm currently staying there. It's fun to see people come back and live above the businesses. In 1861, President James Buchanan appointed A.T. Hodge as Sedalia's first postmaster. 6 months later, he left that post and joined the Army, the Confederates. And as the Civil War interrupted the progress with the post office, it also interrupted the rest of the city. Construction came to a dead halt. It's said that not a nail was driven after May 1st, 1861. The city's focus changed from building to bushwhackers, from settling to survival. It became a military post in 1861 and remained as such throughout the conflict. Some people obviously decided to bail out. They got out while the getting was good. They abandoned their buildings and their houses, and others, by chance or by circumstance, was said, they decided to stay in the town and eventually became part of its permanent population. One man who stuck was George Fallhaber. He later became mayor of Sedalia. His wife wrote extensively about the experiences of coming to a new town in the war. She wrote that they lived in perpetual fear of a raid, and George Fallhaber had a job with the railroad, so he was entrusted with extremely large amounts of cash. One time he asked his wife, Lily, to conceal $6,000 cash. So she hid part of it in her clothes basket, and she put the basket in a corner and covered it with a cloth. Then she decided that wasn't really secure enough, so she hurriedly hid the money somewhere else. Then she decided she'd dig a hole, and she was afraid somebody had watched her, so she retrieved the money and put it back in the basket and covered it with the cloth. And she went through this process many, many times because Sedalia lived under the threat of a raid at any time. They waited for the sound that would send them into the cellars, send them into hiding. Let's see, I'm going to skip down a little bit. And one particular skirmish that we are going to talk about at length throughout the next year occurred in October 1864 when General Jeff Thompson's army of 2,000 men attacked Sedalia. Lily Fallhaber, the woman with the basket, heard the alarm sound and watched as Sedalians dragged the cannon into place. Then she grabbed her bundle of clothing and took refuge in a cellar. She said she was there with some other women and a couple of obviously ill-at-ease men who never looked at anyone, kept their head down, and eventually just kind of disappeared. This is what she said about it. While in the cellar, we could hear the whistle of the cannonballs and we could hear the splinters fly. The most of us were on our knees, praying for the safety of our dear ones out there in the fray. Now, the Fallhabers are an example of some who came and stuck after the Civil War. Lily opened a photography studio down near Main Street and took pictures of George R. Smith. She was one of the best photographers and known for her ability to make lifelike images of people. Interesting when you think this was 1870 and a woman was in that kind of position. Other merchants actually stayed and they flourished as a result of the war. Still others came to the city when it was a place for the soldiers to stay. There was, matter of fact, a settlement right over there. And after the war, they determined to come back, and they became some of our leading citizens. I've written about them. There are some in a display at the Katy Depot. One was a physician, and he came back after serving as a surgeon here, and longtime Sedalia family. So those are some of the people that came to Sedalia as a new town, just in time for the war, and some of their experiences. I'm going to share one more thing very quickly, and then I'll close out. I can do this without the microphone. I'm going to just do a brief synopsis of the back of this book cover to explain kind of why I do what I do. This describes why I love downtown and why I'm so pleased to see people here today, despite the weather. Some of my best memories involve a glass-encased bear and tea room sandwiches. An unlikely, hard to say, combination? Perhaps. Yet both were highlights of my 1960s strolls along Ohio Street with my mother and grandmother. We'd visit the courthouse, peer at the Katy Bear that was encased in the glass, and stop at the women's lounge in the courthouse. From there, we walked to the C.W. Flower Company, where we savored pimento cheese sandwiches in the downstairs tea room. 4 decades later, I returned to Sedalia with my own children. I was a widow. My children were small, and I brought them back to the place where I had grown up for them to experience what I had. I was eager for them to encounter the Katy Bear and amazed at how less menacing it seemed. The Flowers Tea Room was gone, but I still told my children how mature I felt on my visits there. Seeing the changes 40 years had made to Ohio Street, made me wonder what the street had been like 80, even 120 years before. So through my research, I rolled back the calendar and stripped off the asphalt paving. I went back to the time, the Civil War, when Ohio Street was little more than a dirt road. I followed its progress through the years. And so as I followed the progress, I realized more and more about the fascinating past of the people who came before us, the contributions that they left. And I'd encourage you all, as you have time, even despite the weather, to take a stroll in our lovely downtown and just think about what came before us. Thank you very much.